Hi, everybody. Tonight, we begin a long, drifting journey into the shadowed corridors and sun-drenched temples of ancient Egypt through a story not often told with quiet candor. This is not a tale of shining gold, triumphant conquest, or eternal life in the afterworld, as the tombs might suggest. Instead, we gently uncover the veiled, unsettling truth of what it truly meant to be a pharaoh. With every softly turning page, we explore the loneliness, burdens, betrayals, and eerie rituals that haunted the lives of those crowned as gods on earth. Let yourself relax now, and let the sands of time carry you into the first chapter of this haunting, beautiful mystery. The Nile flowed slowly, the water as dark as ink beneath the pale light of an Egyptian moon. It lapped gently at the banks, cradling the earth with quiet patience, as it had for thousands of years. Along its fertile shores, papyrus swayed in the breeze, and the rhythmic croaking of frogs sang a lullaby for the night. All the land seemed still, but above the horizon, upon a man-made plateau of stone and ceremony, the palace of Pharaoh shone cold and silent. Within its chambers, a boy no older than 14 sat atop a bed of cedar and linen, eyes wide open, unblinking beneath the weight of his crown. He was born to rule, or so they told him. Born of divine essence, of sun god blood, his name was carved into cartouches and praised in incense-laden hymns sung by temple priests who dared not meet his eyes. But within him there stirred a shadow, not the power of gods, but the quiet ache of a child who could never speak freely, never play, never run along the riverbank like the sons of fishermen. His mother had wept once, just once. When he was 7, and the high priest of Amun declared him holy, chosen, lifted his tiny hand to the heavens, and declared that the god Ra now had a vessel upon earth. That night, her cries were muffled behind woven curtains, and the boy, too young to understand but old enough to feel, sat silently on the floor outside her chamber, pressing his ear to the cool stone. They began to prepare him then, with bitter-scented oils and lectures longer than the sun's journey across the sky. He learned of divine lineage, of war and tribute, of appeasing gods with goat's blood and the language of omens. But no one taught him about love or about laughter. These were things beneath the dignity of a pharaoh. His food was tasted before he touched it. His sandals were placed precisely at the foot of his throne each morning. Servants never spoke, only nodded. Guards never turned their backs. And in this carefully choreographed world, the boy began to lose the sound of his own voice. He would whisper to the stone columns at night, telling them of dreams he could never confess by daylight. Once, a pet cat followed him into the garden, a small striped creature that purred at his feet and mewed with soft persistence. For a time, it became his only companion. He named it Nibbit, a word meaning golden one, and he loved it with the depth only a lonely child can. But when the vizier saw him cradling it in his arms, he ordered the cat removed, claiming it was unclean for a god to coddle beasts. Nebbit was gone the next morning, and the boy never saw it again. From that moment, the silence of the palace thickened. It became a second skin, one he could not remove. He was watched always, not out of concern, but out of fear that he might stray from his divine image, that he might become too human. The priests came often. They brought scrolls and incantations, rituals to reinforce his divinity. They burned resinous myrrh and taught him to sit still for hours, cross-legged, eyes closed, as the temple drums thundered around him. He was told to speak with authority, but to feel nothing. He must not love, nor mourn, nor question. Those were flaws of mortals. At night, though, when the torches were snuffed and only the moonlight cast its glow upon the lotus-shaped pillars, he would lie on the cold floor and draw shapes in the dust. Boats, trees, a cat with striped fur. He missed the way Nebbit would rest its chin upon his ankle, purring like a soft drumbeat. That was a comfort no priest could provide. On his 15th birthday, the boy was paraded through the city. He wore a golden mask shaped like Horus, with falcon's eyes and a curved beak. His steps were measured, his arms held outward in a silent benediction. Thousands knelt before him, their voices a wave of awe and fear. But behind the mask, his eyes stung with tears. He did not feel divine. He felt hollow. When he returned to the palace that night, he was told that one of the royal daughters, his half-sister, would soon be wed to him, to preserve the sacred bloodline. She was 16, soft-voiced and pale, and she wept upon hearing the news. He did not know her name. The boy Pharaoh now understood something clearer than any temple lesson. To wear the crown was to be imprisoned in plain sight, to have one's soul carved into stone before it ever had a chance to breathe. And so, the days passed like sand through slender fingers. He sat upon his throne and made decrees he did not understand. He watched generals kneel before him, then march to war in his name. He watched peasants bow, their eyes never lifting. He ate from golden platters but tasted nothing. No one called him by name anymore. Only Pharaoh, only God King, only Shadow. But somewhere deep within, the boy still remembered the warmth of a small body curled against his, the whisper of leaves in a garden breeze, and the simple joy of drawing in dust. And as the stars wheeled above the ancient land, he whispered to them, not in command but in quiet yearning, that maybe, just maybe, the gods would hear the voice of a child who had never asked to be divine. The dawn broke slowly over the sandstone walls, painting the horizon with quiet hues of rose and ochre. The palace stirred, but not with the joy of a new day. Servants moved silently along marble corridors, their footsteps muffled by linen sandals, their eyes low. Incense coiled from bronze censers like soft serpents, offering the gods their morning dew. And within the heart of it all, the pharaoh sat motionless, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the gilded lattice of his chamber. He had learned not to blink too often. Too many blinks suggested unease. Unease led to questions, and questions were not meant for gods. At 16, he had grown tall, his frame no longer that of a boy, but his mind, his soul, still trembled under the yoke. There were days when he could not recall the sound of his own laughter, and nights when he awoke with fingers clawing at the silken sheets as though searching for something he'd lost long ago. That morning, the high priest came. He was an old man, his body bent from decades of kneeling before idols and carrying out sacred burdens. Yet he carried himself with dignity, wrapped in layers of bleached linen that rustled like dead leaves. "My lord," he intoned, bowing low, "Ra has whispered a vision. The temple doors must be sealed for 7 days. You are to enter the sanctum and fast. The gods await your communion." The pharaoh did not speak immediately. He merely turned his head slowly, eyes meeting the priests with that practiced emptiness. Inside, a storm brewed, but none could see it. "I understand," he said, his voice smooth, trained. And so the preparations began. They dressed him in white, unblemished robes and painted his skin with blue lotus oil. His head was shaved clean again, the cool blade dragging across his scalp in steady rhythm. The women who anointed him did not speak, but he saw the sadness in their faces, trapped behind duty, behind generations of silence. The sanctum was a place no one else dared to enter. Beyond its threshold lay a chamber carved deep into the rock beneath the temple. There were no windows, no light but what flickered from oil lamps, each flame trembling in the breathless dark. Walls were inscribed with sacred text, stories of creation and chaos, of gods devouring gods, and of the mortal vessel chosen to balance it all. That vessel was him. For 7 days, he sat in the center of the chamber, upon a block of basalt, hands folded in his lap, body still. He did not eat. He did not speak. He barely moved. The darkness pressed close, it whispered. At first, he believed the voices were memory, echoes of tutors, of his mother's lullabies, of priests chanting in endless cycles. But as the days unfolded into nights and the lamps burned low, he began to hear new voices. Feminine, soft, like wind passing through reeds. One voice in particular returned each night, murmuring at the edge of his consciousness. "You are not alone, golden child," it said. "Even gods weep when the stars forget their names." He tried not to answer. Speaking was forbidden. But on the 5th night, as hunger clawed at his belly and his limbs began to tremble from the cold creeping through the stone, he whispered, "Who are you?" The silence that followed was thick. Absolute. He thought perhaps he had imagined it all. That madness was finally curling its fingers around his mind. But then the voice returned, gentler now. "I am what they buried. I am what they forgot. I, too, once wore the crown." The hairs on his arms stood on end. He closed his eyes, yet the darkness behind them was no different than what surrounded him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, not as a pharaoh, but as a child. "Only to be remembered," the voice said. "You carry their names, their blood, their burdens, but not their truths. I can show you." He felt the ground tilt beneath him, not physically, but in the way time itself seemed to unravel. The chamber swam in dim amber light, and in the flicker of the flame, the walls seemed to move. The carvings shimmered. One figure, once still and etched in stone, now looked back at him. A woman, regal, with the uraeus serpent upon her brow, but with eyes full of sorrow. She looked like him, not in body, but in loneliness, in the shape of grief carved upon her brow. "I was Pharaoh," the figure said, "but I was buried beneath the names of men, my victories attributed to others, my pain erased." The boy leaned forward, heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked again. "I was Merit Amun, forgotten sister, forgotten queen. They left my tomb unfinished, buried me beneath a man's title so they could preserve their line. I waited. Centuries passed, and still they sing only of kings." The pharaoh's breath was shallow now, barely audible. "Why show yourself to me?" "Because you feel what I felt, the weight, the silence, the endless watching." He nodded slowly. "You are not meant to rule, child. You are meant to endure." And with those words, the flame sputtered. Darkness returned, and the boy felt a single tear trace the line of his jaw. When he emerged from the sanctum on the 8th morning, his face was paler, his eyes darker. The priests knelt. The temple women lowered their heads, but none dared ask what he had seen. None dared speak of the change they sensed in him. That night, as he sat alone in his chamber, he took a reed brush and began to draw upon the back of a discarded scroll. Not hieroglyphs, not formal signs, but a face, a woman's face. Regal, strong, Merit Amun. He did not know why he did it, only that he must, because in the end, even gods need someone to remember them. The seasons drifted over the land like silt upon the Nile, slow, inevitable, and unseen until the change had already taken root. The pharaoh, though still young in flesh, bore the quiet stillness of a man much older. In the inner courtyards of the palace, he no longer walked with the hesitant steps of a boy. His stride had become smooth, almost ritualistic, as though he moved not by choice but by design, like the sacred barges that glided along the ceremonial waters during the festival of Opet. Yet within him, something had begun to stir. Merit Amun's voice no longer whispered through temple walls, but her presence lingered in strange ways. He saw her shadow in the flickering torches, in the lines of statues no longer familiar, in the subtle curve of a servant girl's glance. It was not haunting, it was remembering, a kind of quiet rebellion that warmed the edges of his isolation. Still, the duties of his divine office pressed ever onward. That month, he was to be consecrated once again before the high altar of Enra in Thebes, an elaborate affair requiring weeks of planning and 1,000 hands. Sacred texts were recited, animals chosen for sacrifice, gold polished until it reflected the desert sun like fire. He was dressed in linen of such purity it could not be touched by mortal hands. Kohl was traced beneath his eyes in sacred geometry, and a falcon-feathered fan was carried behind him with every step. The procession moved slowly through the capital, crowds lined like fields along the streets. People wept as he passed, reaching out their hands not to touch him, none would dare, but simply to feel the wind that followed in his wake. In their eyes, he saw awe. Yes, but also something else. Hunger. Not for food, but for blessing, for meaning, for miracles that never truly came, and for a brief, terrible moment, he hated them for it. He hated that they believed in the lie, that they prayed to a child molded into a god instead of asking why their prayers never reached the heavens. But the thought passed quickly, swallowed by the rhythm of ritual. He stood before the altar, arms raised, voice low and controlled, reciting words older than empire. Around him, incense thickened the air, and drums pounded like heartbeats of the earth. Priests circled in a dance of invocation, eyes closed in reverent ecstasy. Somewhere beyond them, doves were loosed into the sky, their white feathers catching the morning light. The gods, he was told, had accepted his offerings. But in the quiet that followed, after the crowds dispersed and the rituals concluded, he found himself alone again in the chambers of the great temple. A hush lingered there, thick, sacred, and strangely comforting. He wandered into a side corridor rarely used. The stone beneath his feet felt colder, and the air carried a trace of moisture from the sacred pools hidden deep within the earth. Along the walls, faded paintings told stories no one recited anymore. Stories of gods who wept, of queens who ruled behind masks, of stars that fell from the sky only to be buried and forgotten. And there, in a small alcove half swallowed by time, he found her. A statue, no taller than his chest, carved from black basalt, a woman with wide eyes and a cobra-shaped diadem. No name inscribed, no offering laid at her feet. She was half consumed by dust and shadow, but her gaze pierced him like sunlight through storm clouds. Merit Amun. He knelt without knowing why. The stone was rough beneath his knees, but he stayed there, head bowed, one hand resting gently against the statue's base. "I see you," he whispered. And for a moment he thought he felt the air shift, a warmth that had nothing to do with sunlight. A presence, silent yet full, like the hush between a question and its answer. After that day, he returned often to the alcove. He never spoke aloud again, but he brought small gifts, fragments of colored glass, petals from the lotus ponds, a lock of hair from his own crown, placed delicately at her feet. He did not know if it mattered, if the gods noticed or cared. But it gave him a sense of quiet, of purpose beyond performance. Outside the temple, his responsibilities multiplied. The priests whispered of omens, storms rising in the east, locusts in the fields, a sudden illness among the cattle. The people grew restless. Whispers of rebellion flickered through the desert towns like sparks waiting for wind. They turned to him, always to him. "Pharaoh," they said, "speak to the gods." "Pharaoh," they pleaded, "restore the balance." He gave the speeches, he performed the rites. But inside he knew there were no gods watching. Only silence, only shadows. One evening, as he stood on a balcony overlooking the Nile, he saw a funeral procession drifting downriver. No music, no gilded boats, just a line of canoes, each one bearing a torch, and in the center a wooden platform bearing a wrapped body. A child, he thought, judging by the size. He watched in stillness until the procession vanished beyond the curve of the reeds. And in that moment, he envied the child, not because it was dead, but because it had been held, carried, mourned. When he turned away, he found his half-sister standing in the corridor. They had not spoken in months, not since their binding ceremony, conducted more for form than for feeling. Her eyes were rimmed in kohl, her face unreadable. "You look thinner," she said quietly. He nodded once. "I forget to eat." She stepped forward, then paused. "Do you ever wish you were someone else?" He blinked. "I don't know who I am," he replied. They stood in silence, the weight of their lineage pressing down upon them, like the stones of the very pyramids that bore their ancestors' names. And in that silence, something passed between them. Not love, not even kinship, but a recognition. Two birds in the same cage, two statues carved from the same grief. The next morning, he returned to the hidden alcove in the temple. The statue of Merit Amun remained untouched, waiting, and beside it, he placed a slip of parchment. Upon it, a single word, "Remember." The desert wind had begun to change. It whispered through the stone corridors like an old woman's breath, dry, uncertain, and weary. The sun still burned as it always had, but there was a strange heaviness in the heat, a sensation that things beneath the surface were shifting, cracking, preparing to rise. The pharaoh felt it in his bones. He had begun to dream again. But these were not dreams of childhood gardens or mewling cats. These dreams came cloaked in veils of sand and smoke. He would walk endless passageways of limestone and obsidian, chased by faceless priests, their mouths sewn shut with golden thread. Sometimes he was a falcon, trapped in a cage of turquoise and ivory. Other times he was himself, naked and crowned, standing in an empty throne room while the pillars crumbled around him like dust. Each morning he awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat, lips parted in the echo of screams he never remembered giving voice to. And still, the rituals continued. Every day he was dressed in new linen, oiled and powdered with crushed lotus and resin. His food was tasted, his path cleared. He heard petitions from nobles whose names he barely recalled, signed decrees etched by hands not his own, and nodded to generals with sand-blasted faces and eyes like sharpened obsidian. He had grown taller still, and his voice had settled into a tone the court called divine. But none dared say what everyone sensed, that something within him was unraveling. One morning he stood before a mirror, one of polished copper, set into a frame of ebony and lapis, and studied the face that stared back. It was beautiful by the standards of the court, symmetrical, serene, lined with kohl and framed by the false beard of royalty. But to him, it looked like a mask, a death mask, polished to perfection and entirely hollow. He reached up slowly and peeled the ceremonial beard away. It came off with a soft snap. Without it, he looked younger, almost human. He set it aside, and for the first time in months, he left his chamber without it. The palace rippled, eyes widened, servants stilled mid-step. A single cup dropped and shattered, its sound echoing like thunder. But no one spoke. They bowed as always, lower perhaps, quieter, but no words passed their lips. That day, he met with the chief architect. There were plans for a new temple, vast, excessive, meant to eclipse even the great sanctuaries of Karnak. It was to be built in his honor, funded by heavy taxes that had already begun to wither the barley fields of the southern gnomes. The architect, a thin man with meticulous gestures and skin like dried papyrus, laid out the scrolls with practiced grace. "This chamber will house the eternal flame," he explained, tapping a painted rectangle. "This one, your personal crypt. We have consulted the stars to ensure perfect alignment with the sun at solstice. Your spirit will rise with Ra himself." The pharaoh said nothing. "And here," the architect continued, "a causeway lined with statues, each one bearing your likeness, carved from granite brought from Aswan. Immense, unmovable, your image shall walk beside itself for eternity." The pharaoh's gaze slid across the parchment. Rows of himself, cast in stone, watching forever. He looked up slowly. "How long will it take to build?" 27 years, my lord." A silence hung between them. Then the pharaoh folded the scroll shut and stood. "No," he said simply. The architect blinked. "My lord. No statues, no temple, no tomb." The man paled. "But the records, the legacy, your spirit, my spirit," the pharaoh said, voice low, "has no need for stone." He left without further word, his sandals whispering across the polished floor. That evening, he walked the palace gardens alone. The sky was a tapestry of fire, orange, crimson, and violet bleeding into each other above the horizon. Date palms swayed softly in the breeze, and the first stars blinked into view like watchful eyes. He found himself drawn to the lotus pond, a quiet place forgotten by most. The water was still, save for the occasional flick of a silver fish. There, among the reeds, sat a child. He couldn't have been more than 8. A servant's son, perhaps, judging by the worn hem of his tunic. The child didn't see him at first. He was drawing in the dust with a reed. Lines and shapes, crude, playful, something like a bird with wings too wide. The pharaoh stepped closer. The boy looked up, startled, eyes wide. The pharaoh crouched slowly beside him, robes gathering dust, and glanced at the drawing. "Is it a hawk?" he asked. The boy hesitated. "A heron." "It's beautiful." The boy's eyes brightened. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, side by side, the boy's knees muddy, the pharaoh's hands resting on his own lap. No guards, no priests, just 2 souls beneath the dusk. "Do you live here?" the pharaoh asked gently. "My mother works in the kitchens. She lets me come here if I stay quiet." He nodded. They watched the pond in silence. After a while, the boy asked, "Are you a priest?" The pharaoh smiled faintly. "Something like that." The boy stared at him a moment longer. "You look sad." He didn't answer. Instead, he took the reed from the boy's hand and drew his own line in the dirt. Just one, curved, soft, the shape of a petal. They left the drawing there, unfinished, and when the boy ran off at the call of his mother, the pharaoh remained, watching the stars flicker into life above the trembling water. For the first time in many weeks, he felt something close to peace. Not divine, not eternal, just quiet, just human. And that night, he slept without dreams. The days grew longer, the air thicker, with a kind of silence that pulsed just beneath the surface of things. It was as though the entire palace breathed more carefully now, as if the walls themselves listened. No one spoke of the pharaoh's changes aloud, but the shifts were undeniable. The priests noticed it first. Subtle absences from morning rites, missed offerings, hours spent unaccounted for in gardens or along the hidden corridors of the temple. His half-sister noticed too, though she said nothing. She had grown used to absence. He had stopped wearing the ceremonial beard entirely. He allowed his natural hair to grow back, curling softly against the base of his neck in defiance of the polished tradition. He still attended council, still bore the golden crook and flail when demanded, but something in his gaze had changed. He no longer looked through people as a god might. He looked at them as if he saw more than flesh and robes. He saw weariness, doubt, and longing. And for many, that was more terrifying than the stern gaze of Ra himself. One evening, as the court gathered for a feast celebrating the flood's retreat, he did not appear. The palace murmured. The vizier, stiff and ceremonial, made excuses. He fasts in honor of Hapi, the river god. The pharaoh's absence is itself a blessing. But in truth, the pharaoh had climbed the eastern wall of the garden alone, shrouded in a simple cloak, and walked quietly through the city under cover of dusk. The air in the city was thicker, humid with the recent flood, and the streets were lined with lamp oil and soft laughter. Children ran barefoot through alleyways, their hands sticky with dates, while women sat in doorways weaving reeds and singing old songs to the rhythm of their fingers. He moved like a ghost among them, unnoticed in the fading light. No chariots, no guards. Just a boy, tall and watchful, beneath a cloak of gray. He passed a baker pulling blackened bread from a stone oven, a woman washing linen in the canal, her baby strapped to her back with fraying linen, a blind man playing a flute beneath an archway, his dog curled asleep by his feet. Each of them belonged to a world he had only ever glimpsed through the narrow prism of duty. He followed the music. It led him to a courtyard where a dozen people sat in a loose circle around a small fire. There was no ceremony, only presence. Someone passed a jug of date wine. A girl clapped a rhythm and another sang, a song about a fisherman who fell in love with a crocodile spirit. The laughter that followed was unforced, warm, alive. He stood in the shadows for a long time, watching, listening. No one bowed. No one whispered titles. They simply lived. He had forgotten what that looked like. Then someone turned, eyes meeting his. It was a woman, older, her face lined with sun and time. She squinted, tilted her head. "Come closer, stranger," she said. "The night's too long to spend alone." He hesitated, but something in her voice, so casual, so unconcerned, called to him. He stepped into the circle. No one gasped. No one dropped their cup. They made space. He sat cross-legged on the warm stone. Someone passed him a fig. He took it. For a moment, he forgot he was Pharaoh. He listened to a boy recite a tale about a ghost that haunted the river reeds. He watched a young girl make shapes in the dirt with a stick, laughing when her brother tried to guess them. He saw lovers press their foreheads together, whispering promises in the hush of firelight. And then the old woman looked at him again. "You're quiet," she said. He nodded. "I'm listening." She gave a slow, knowing smile. "You've listened a long time, haven't you?" He blinked. "Too long," she added. And though he said nothing, a part of him folded inward, like a papyrus leaf touched by flame. He left before the moon reached its peak. When he returned to the palace, the guards said nothing, though their eyes followed him with growing unease. He washed the city from his hands, but not from his mind. And that night, he returned to the hidden alcove in the temple, where the statue of Merit Amun waited, unblinking. He placed another parchment at her feet. This time, he did not write. He drew. A circle of people, simple and curved, a fire in the middle, a boy in a cloak sitting quietly among them. He looked at the drawing for a long time, then whispered, "They are more alive than we ever were." No voice answered, no warmth stirred, only the stillness of stone and memory. And yet he left the chamber with a strange feeling in his chest, not joy, not sorrow, but something between them. A space opening, slowly, like a chamber sealed too long, a beginning or an ending. He could not yet tell, but he knew now. If he were ever to become free, it would not be by the hands of priests or scribes, nor by monuments cast in gold. It would be by walking among shadows and learning to see. The palace had begun to feel less like a throne and more like a cage dressed in finery. Even the breeze through its high colonnades seemed to carry with it the scent of stagnation. The great pools of water that once shimmered like mirrors now felt still, like eyes watching but never blinking. Marble floors reflected golden ceilings, and yet beneath all this splendor, a silence brewed, a quiet kind of rot that no ritual could sweep away. The pharaoh no longer rose at dawn with the same obedience. He would linger in bed, half wrapped in linens, gazing at the ceiling where painted vultures circled eternally, their wings outstretched in static protection. He had once found comfort in those ancient symbols, but now they felt hollow. Like masks upon masks, painted smiles in a theater, no one had the courage to leave. He no longer trusted the high priest. It was not a sudden betrayal, nor some treasonous whisper. It was a slow unraveling, a glance too cold, a chant too mechanical, a blessing uttered with a tongue that tasted of politics. The priest was aging, his hands trembling slightly now as he offered incense, but his grip on power had never been firmer. And as the pharaoh watched him from behind the veil of his official serenity, he began to see the truth. He was not being guided. He was being managed. The gods were not speaking through the priest. The priest was speaking for the gods. And worse, he was speaking for Pharaoh, too. One morning, the Pharaoh summoned his sister. It had been weeks since their last quiet exchange in the corridor. Her face had grown leaner, her voice more restrained, as though she too felt the walls closing in. "You sent for me?" she asked, eyes wary. He nodded. "I did." They sat in silence on a terrace overlooking the palm groves. Below, the workers could be seen leading donkeys along the banks, baskets of silt balanced atop their backs. The Nile shimmered in the distance, endless and uncaring. "I want to leave," he said finally. Her head turned sharply. "Leave? The palace?" He shook his head. "Everything." She studied him for a long time, the wind tugging at the hem of her veil. "Where would you go?" He exhaled slowly. "I don't know." She looked away, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You won't get far. You're the sun. The people would notice when you vanish from the sky." "I'm not the sun," he said softly. "I'm a boy who has forgotten how to feel sunlight." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, "Do you remember our mother's lullaby?" He blinked. "A little." "She used to hum it when the storms came. Do you remember? She said the gods argued during storms, and that the lullaby made them listen." He closed his eyes. A faint melody stirred in his memory, thin, distant, like a reed flute played from the bottom of a well. "You could die out there," she whispered. "There are snakes, rebels, sandstorms." "I could die in here," he replied, "and no one would even know the difference." Later that night, he returned to the statue of Merit Amun. A single oil lamp lit the alcove. Its flame danced softly, casting shadows against the wall like trembling hands. He knelt, and for the first time he spoke without whispering. "I want to go where you went." The silence around him thickened. "I want to walk without being followed. I want to speak without being echoed." Still, no voice answered. But something shifted. A breath of wind, though the air was still. A flicker in the flame, though no draft stirred. He took it as a sign. 3 nights later, he disappeared. No proclamation was made, no feast, no farewell. He slipped from the palace in the hour before dawn, when even the guards dozed lightly at their posts and the stars still clung to the sky like forgotten jewels. He wore no crown, no gold, only a simple cloak and a satchel of dried figs and barley bread. The eastern gate opened for him as if it knew, and then, for the first time in his life, he passed beyond the walls not as a god, not as a king, but as something far more rare, a wanderer. He did not look back. The road ahead was not charted. There were no priests, no scribes, no guards to clear the way. Just the desert, vast and waiting, the morning wind biting gently at his cheeks. With every step, he felt the weight loosen. His feet sank into sand, his breath steadied, and with each passing hour, the silence became less a burden and more a companion. He did not yet know what he was searching for, but for the first time, he was asking the question for himself. And somewhere, deep beneath the temple, in a forgotten alcove, a statue stood unchanging. But the dust at her feet had been brushed away, the offerings gone, and the chamber, long silent, seemed just a little warmer. The desert was a language he did not yet understand. At first, the pharaoh thought he would feel fear, naked under the weight of sky, with no walls to shield him, no rituals to guide his hands. But fear did not come, only silence and the dry rasp of wind across sand. The Nile had long since disappeared behind him, and with it the last tendrils of his old life. He moved east, following no path, guided only by the stars, and a feeling that tugged gently at his chest like a thread woven into the seams of his soul. He walked during the cool hours of dawn and dusk, resting by day beneath rock overhangs or beneath thin cloth stretched between broken acacia. His royal hands, once softened by oils and shielded from the sun, blistered and darkened. His feet grew calloused, his shoulders sore. He did not complain. Each ache felt like a shedding, a letting go of everything he had once been taught to wear like armor. The food he carried did not last long. He learned to dig for roots, to crack open desert melons, and to watch the birds. Where they circled, water was often near. He found a small oasis 3 days' journey from the palace, ringed by tamarisk and date palms. Its pool was shallow, but the water clear. He drank greedily, cupped his hands, and washed the dust from his face. Then, with his reflection shimmering before him, he stared. The boy who looked back was no longer Pharaoh. No kohl rimmed his eyes. No gold adorned his brow. His cheeks were hollowed from sun and hunger, his jaw shadowed with the beginnings of a beard. But his eyes were alive. Not with divinity, but with something far more elusive: curiosity. That night he lit a small fire with dried dung and twigs, shielding the flame with his body. Above him, the sky stretched wide and brilliant. Stars poured across it like spilled sand, and for the first time in years he tried to name them not as symbols in a temple chart, but as companions. Sopdet, the dog star. Sa, the soul of Osiris. He whispered their names not in ritual, but as a greeting. "Do you remember me?" he asked them softly. No answer came, only the wind. But in the warmth of the fire he began to hum, not a hymn, not a chant, the lullaby, the one his mother had sung. It came hesitantly at first, a fragment of sound half lost to memory. But then it grew stronger, fuller, until it drifted into the dark like a prayer meant not for gods, but for himself. In the days that followed, he continued walking. He passed shepherds who looked at him with suspicion and traders who ignored him entirely. He offered help when he could, lifting bundles, gathering wood. In return, they gave him bread, a flask of goat's milk, a place near their fires. One night, an old man spoke to him. "You're not from here," the man said. "No," he replied. "You carry yourself like someone trying to forget." The pharaoh did not answer. The old man tossed a twig into the flames. "My son ran away from his family once, thought he'd find answers in the dunes, came back with silence instead." "Did it help him?" the pharaoh asked. "No," the man said, smiling faintly, "but it made him quieter." The next morning, the pharaoh rose before the others and slipped away. In the solitude of the hills, he found a cave, a cleft in the rock barely wide enough to enter. Inside, it was cool and dry, the walls etched with soot and ancient marks. Someone had lived here once, a hunter perhaps, or a hermit. He sat at the mouth of the cave and watched the sunrise. Its light crept slowly across the desert, touching each grain of sand like a blessing. And he realized something. He did not miss the palace, not its corridors, not its grandeur, not the throne. But he did miss the statue, Merit Amun. He missed the way her eyes, though carved of stone, had seemed to hold memory, to see him not as pharaoh, but as something deeper, a witness. He reached into his satchel and withdrew the last of his parchment. With a piece of charcoal, he drew her face again, gently, slowly. Then beside it, he drew his own. 2 faces, both alone, both watching. And then, with deliberate care, he drew a line connecting them. It was not art, not sacred, just a line. But it was the first thing he had made for himself. Later that day, he followed a trail deeper into the hills. It led him to a village, a small one, clustered around a dry riverbed. Mud brick houses leaned against each other like tired shoulders, and smoke drifted lazily from a communal hearth. He paused at the edge. No one saw him yet. For a moment, he thought to turn back. But then a child ran by, barefoot and laughing, chased by a dog with a stick in its mouth. He smiled. And for the first time since leaving the palace, he stepped forward. Not as a god, not as a king, but as a man. And the desert, in its ancient stillness, welcomed him. The village welcomed him not with trumpets or banners, but with indifference, the kind that only true peace can afford. No one questioned where he came from. No one bowed. They simply let him exist, as though he were a wind-blown traveler whose presence stirred neither fear nor awe. It was a mercy he had never known. He found work quickly. A man named Heket, thick-armed and sun-darkened, needed help reinforcing his roof before the seasonal winds returned. The pharaoh, no longer pharaoh in name or bearing, climbed the thatch and passed bundles of dried reed, while the children below shouted advice and chased one another through the dust. His fingers bled on the first day. By the third, he no longer noticed. They began to call him Senu, a name meaning brother. It had not been his name before, but when Heket's wife asked what she should call him, he had said the word without thinking. It felt strange and right all at once. A name that required no ceremony, no history, just presence. Sanu slept in a lean-to beside the animal pen, beneath a roof patched with palm fronds and bits of broken pottery. Chickens wandered beneath his feet, and goats nibbled the hem of his tunic when he was not watching. He mended fences, hauled water, listened to old men argue over planting schedules, and heard young girls sing to the moon from rooftops at night. The rhythms of village life were slow and grounding. Every task had a reason, every hour a purpose. There were no high priests here, no altars smeared with blood, no scrolls predicting the favor of the gods, only wind and work and warmth. But still, the past would not leave him entirely. Some nights, Sanu woke with the taste of incense in his throat, as though he'd wandered back into the sanctum while he slept. He would rise quietly, walk past the sleeping goats, and sit beneath the stars until the dreams passed. One night, he heard music. Not the drums of the temple, nor the chants of the priesthood, but something simpler. Flutes and clapping, laughter and voices. He followed the sound through narrow alleys until he came upon a gathering lit by firelight. It was a festival, he realized, honoring the village's well and the spirits of the ancestors who had once carved it from the rock. No idols, no gold, just woven lanterns and dried figs strung on palm rope. A girl handed him a cup of honeyed beer. A boy offered him a carved bone charm for luck. Sanu accepted both with a nod, his heart thudding in a rhythm unfamiliar to him. Not fear, not duty, something gentler. The people began to dance, awkward, joyful movements, untrained but heartfelt. When a hand reached out to him, he hesitated only a moment before taking it. He danced, not as a ruler commanding adoration, not as a symbol etched in stone, but as Senu, brother, stranger, man. The fire cast his shadow on the walls of the houses around him, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of himself as others saw him. A tall, quiet figure with a crooked smile and rough hands. No one whispered about gods. No one asked for blessings. Only company. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, he sat beside an old woman who wore silver rings in her hair and spoke in riddles. "You came from far," she said, her voice like sand over stone. He nodded. "You carry something heavy." He did not reply. She reached into her robe and drew forth a scrap of faded linen upon which was stitched the Eye of Horus. She held it out to him. "You must bury it," she said. Sanu blinked. "Why?" "So it no longer looks back." He stared at the cloth, the eye so familiar, so woven into the marrow of who he had once been. He thought of the throne room, the chants, the mask, the silence, the loneliness. He accepted the cloth. Later, just before dawn, he walked to the edge of the fields where the earth was soft and unworked. He dug a small hole with his hands, placed the eye within, and covered it gently. He said no prayer. He simply whispered, "Rest." The wind blew softly through the stalks of barley, and somewhere deep within, a knot began to loosen. Days passed, then weeks. He became known not for who he had been, but for the way he helped carry water, the way he made the youngest laugh by whistling like a desert thrush, the way he listened, really listened, when someone spoke. He never said where he came from, and no one asked. They had their suspicions, perhaps. A man with posture too perfect, eyes too deep, but in the desert, names carried less weight than kindness. And so the Pharaoh vanished, and Senu lived. One morning, as he walked along the edge of the fields, he saw something in the distance, half buried in sand and time. A shattered stela. The top had broken clean, its name erased by wind or hand. But the carving remained, two figures side by side, hands clasped, their faces turned not toward gods, but toward each other. He traced it with his fingers, and for the first time in years, he felt no ache. Only recognition. The rains came early that year, not in torrents, but in slow, steady drops that softened the edge of every sound. The desert air thickened with the scent of wet earth, and the village transformed beneath the blessing. Children danced barefoot in the puddles, their laughter echoing off the clay walls, while old men sat beneath thatched awnings, sipping spiced tea and recounting stories older than memory. Senu stood beneath the eaves of Hiket's home, watching the rain trace delicate patterns on the ground. It reminded him of the temple courtyards after ritual washing, how the water would gather between the tiles, how the incense smoke would spiral upward as the sky darkened above. But this rain held no incense, no prayers, no offerings, just water, just sky, just now. He had grown used to simplicity, to the way his hands now bore small scars from farm tools and stone, to the ache in his legs at the end of a long day. He welcomed it, even when his muscles trembled, even when the sun burned hot against the back of his neck. Pain was honest. It asked for nothing, offered no flattery. It simply existed and faded. That morning he helped repair a collapsed wall near the granary. The mud bricks had given way from the weight of the rain, and villagers worked together with rope, timber, and grit. Senu hauled water and clay, kneading it with his feet until it was thick and strong. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. His presence had become a kind of rhythm, expected, welcome, part of the village's daily breath. And then, that evening, a traveler arrived. She came with the rain, wrapped in a blue shawl embroidered with gold thread. Her sandals were worn, and her hair braided tightly against her scalp. Her skin bore the softness of someone not long from the riverbanks, yet her eyes held the faraway look of someone who had crossed deserts. The village watched her with polite interest, but not suspicion. Senu saw her first near the well. She had paused to drink, cupping her hands carefully, as though the act itself were sacred. Their eyes met. She didn't bow, didn't flinch, just looked, really looked. And in that look, he felt something stir. Recognition? No, not quite, but something close, like hearing a song you don't remember knowing until the melody wraps around your bones. She stayed the night with the Potter's family, who offered her a place by the hearth and a bowl of barley stew. The next morning, she joined the workers in the field, asking no special favor. She was quiet, efficient, and strong. When asked her name, she replied simply, Neferu. Neferu. Beautiful one. Senu noticed how the old women watched her, curious but cautious. How the children followed her movements, as if she brought with her a secret they might uncover by watching closely. That night, he sat beside her near the fire. They didn't speak at first, just watched the flames. Then she said, "This village is quiet." He nodded. "That's why I stayed." "You came here by choice?" Eventually. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were the color of river mud, deep and unknowable. "I think I knew you once," she said. He met her gaze, unblinking. "I think many people say that." "No," she said gently. "Not from stories, from silence." A long pause stretched between them. Then he asked, "Why did you come?" She turned back to the fire. "Because I needed to forget something. And instead, I remembered something else." He understood. In the days that followed, they worked side by side, repairing irrigation ditches, gathering herbs. Once they chased down a goat that had escaped into the hills, laughing breathlessly as it darted and dodged, unconcerned by either of their titles or their hidden pasts. They did not speak of who they had been. But in small ways, they showed each other. Senu would hum the lullaby when he thought no one was listening. Neferu would trace patterns in the dirt, symbols half lost to time. One afternoon, as they sat beneath a fig tree, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a tiny object wrapped in cloth. She placed it in his hand. A scarab carved from lapis, its wings spread slightly. Senu turned it over. The inscription on its belly was faint, almost erased, but not completely. It was the name of a queen, Merit Amun. His throat tightened. Neferu watched him, her expression unreadable. "I found it near the cliffs west of Akhenaten, buried in a priest's robe. I think it was meant to be hidden." He nodded slowly, unable to speak. "She was real," Neferu said softly. "I know." They sat in silence after that. Later that night, he returned to his small shelter and placed the scarab beside his drawing of the two figures, the queen and the boy, now weathered from dust and time. And for the first time, he allowed himself to grieve. Not loudly, not in anguish, but with a quiet, steady ache that rolled through him like water through dry reed beds. He wept not for the throne, not even for himself, but for the centuries of forgotten queens, of voices swallowed by stone, of lives reduced to symbols. He wept for Merit Amun, and when he finally slept, his dreams were filled not with temples or crowns, but with a woman standing beneath a fig tree, holding out a scarab, and smiling gently as if to say, "You remember now, that is enough." The days passed more gently after that. The air was cooler, the light softer, as though the world itself had sensed the turning of something inside him and responded with mercy. The rain had washed away the dust from the rooftops, and the fields were now streaked with new green, young shoots pressing upward with quiet defiance against the sky. Senu moved through the village like a thread in a woven cloth. Unassuming, essential. People began to speak more freely in his presence, no longer guarded or overly polite. He had become part of the background hum, like the creaking of ropes or the lowing of cattle. His hands were always busy, his shoulders always bearing some shared load, but now there was ease in his step, a softness in his face that hadn't been there before. And Neferu stayed. She settled in without asking, as though the village had called her too. She helped with childbirths, prepared healing pastes from herbs gathered at dawn, and told stories at twilight that made the youngest lean in and the elders nod with knowing smiles. She never revealed where she had come from, and no one pressed her. Her presence was enough. One evening, under a sky the color of smoldering bronze, they sat together on a slope overlooking the barley fields. The wind combed gently through the stalks, and the horizon glowed with the hush of coming night. Neferu broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about going back?" Senu didn't look at her. "To the palace? To any of it?" He was quiet a long moment. Then, "Sometimes I wonder what became of the statue. The one I used to visit, the others I do not miss." "The statue," she said, "of the queen." He nodded. "She was erased, forgotten, and yet she was the only one who ever saw me." "Perhaps she still does," Neferu whispered. He looked at her then. She had a way of speaking that wasn't quite human, more like a reed instrument, shaped by wind, delicate and precise. She could say more with a glance than others did with a sermon. "I don't think I would survive that life again," he said. "You wouldn't," she replied softly, "because you are no longer the boy they crowned." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was rich with understanding. Then, gently, she reached into her robe and pulled something new. A small wooden tablet, wrapped in linen. She handed it to him. Senu unfolded the cloth slowly. Upon the tablet was a carving, not elaborate, not royal, just a boat with two figures in it, one rowing, one watching the sky. "I made it," she said. He traced the edge of the boat with his thumb. "Are we sailing away?" "No," she said. "We're sailing home." Later, he placed the tablet beside the scarab and the drawing in his shelter. It rested there like a prayer answered without words. In the days that followed, Senu and Neferu began to walk farther from the village. They would leave before dawn, carrying dried bread, water skins, and sometimes nothing at all. They followed goat trails up into the low hills or walked the cracked banks of forgotten tributaries. Sometimes they spoke, often they did not. In one such journey, they discovered a small cave tucked behind a fall of rock. Within, the walls were covered in faded images, ancient, older than any dynasty he had ever studied. Not gods, but people, herding, dancing, holding hands. And among them, near the rear wall, two figures stood apart. One bore a crown, the other carried a basket. Their arms were stretched toward each other, not in worship, but in recognition. Senu stared at them for a long time. Neferu sat cross-legged beside a fire, grinding herbs into powder with the ease of ritual. He turned to her. "Do you think people can live more than once?" She tilted her head. "You mean reincarnation?" "No," he said. "I mean, can a soul have more than one life within the same skin, as though one life must die for another to be born?" She considered that. Then she said, "If that is true, I think you are on your third." "Third? The first was when you were crowned. The second was when you ran, and this," she gestured around them, "this is the one you chose." He was quiet. Then he said, "What about you?" She smiled faintly. "I think I'm still in my second, but it's almost ready to end." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the cave, the hills, the whole wide silence of the desert held its breath. He reached out. She did too. Their fingers met, not grasping, not clinging, just resting, palm to palm, and in that touch something passed between them. Not a promise, not a vow, just knowing. They left the cave at dusk. The stars were beginning to bloom, and the moon cast silver over every dune. As they descended back toward the village, Senu carried no tablets, no parchment, no signs of power. But in his chest, something glowed steady and quiet. He was not a pharaoh. He was not a symbol. He was simply a man who had died and learned to live again. And for now, that was more than enough. The summer settled across the land like a slow breath, its heat wrapping the village in waves of shimmering gold. The Nile, though distant from their dry province, still murmured its ancient lullaby into the hearts of those who had once lived near its banks. Fields flourished with barley and lentils, goats grew fat on wild clover, and the dates on the tallest palms began to ripen in clusters like amber pearls. Senu rose early now, earlier even than the birds. Each morning he walked the perimeter of the village alone, listening to the hush before labor began, the wind brushing low along the mud walls, the muffled rustle of sleeping animals, the occasional creak of wood as it settled against the sun's promise. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of memory, not of identity, not even of being found. The name Pharaoh had become something he could hear without flinching, like the ghost of a storm long past. He did not speak it, but neither did he run from it. It was part of his skin now, faded and quiet, like an old scar healed beneath the sun. One afternoon, Neferu came to him with news. A caravan was passing nearby, merchants from the south making their way toward Thebes. They would rest at the halfway well for 2 nights, trading spices, linen, and oils. The village would go to meet them, as they did each season, carrying baskets and stories in equal measure. Senu agreed to join. When they reached the gathering place, a low basin surrounded by rocky bluffs, the air was already thick with scent. Cardamom, cumin, frankincense burning low in hanging brass censers. Camels shifted their weight, their cargo wrapped in layers of cloth and bound with intricate knots. Voices danced through the air like the shimmer of the heat itself. Some singing, others laughing, some bartering in harsh tones, others murmuring with reverence. It was a convergence of lives and languages. Among the wares laid out on woven mats, Senu saw a familiar object, a funerary amulet shaped like a tiny jackal. Its glassy eyes stared skyward. Its paws crossed delicately over its chest. The merchant selling it noticed his gaze. "You like it?" the man asked, his accent thick with the southern hills. "From an old tomb near Abydos. Dug up by river thieves, they say. It's genuine." Senu picked it up, the weight of it so much lighter than it had once seemed in memory. He turned it in his fingers. "I knew someone who wore one like this," he said quietly. The merchant raised an eyebrow. "A priest?" "No," Senu said. "A boy who thought it would protect him." The man chuckled. "Did it?" Senu smiled faintly. "No, but it taught him something better." "And what's that?" "That nothing we wear or carry can protect us from the truth of ourselves. Only honesty can." He placed the amulet back on the mat. "Keep it," the merchant said suddenly. "I think it remembers you." Senu shook his head. "It belongs to the past. Let someone else carry it forward." He turned and walked away, the dust curling gently around his steps. That night, the villagers danced with the travelers around the fire. Drums thumped low, and long shawls fluttered in time to the rhythm. Neferu moved with the grace of the wind, her feet brushing the earth as though in quiet conversation with it. Senu sat nearby, his knees drawn up, watching. One of the merchants, older than the rest, leaned toward him. "She is a priestess, no?" he asked. "She was," Senu answered. "And you?" "I was many things." The man nodded knowingly. "Then you are free." Senu considered that. "No," he said at last, "but I'm becoming." The man clapped him on the shoulder. "Better than being finished." As the fire dimmed and the stars awoke, Neferu came to sit beside him. They didn't speak. She laid her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her. And for a moment, the whole world seemed to rest. Not just them, but the air, the earth, the memory of who they had been. Later, as the embers turned to ash, Neferu whispered, "I think I'm ready." Senu turned toward her. "Ready for what?" "To tell you where I came from." He said nothing, just listened. "I was born in the house of the north, under the gaze of Sekhmet, where the lioness watches. My father was a scribe. My mother, she died before I could walk. I was trained to read the stars, to memorize the rites. I was promised to the temple at 13. She paused. "I did not want it. I was told I had been chosen by the gods, but all I saw were men." Her voice grew quieter. "I escaped during a festival, wore a mask, took food from the offering trays, ran until the torches no longer followed." Senu placed his hand over hers. "Why did you come here?" he asked. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dying fire. "Because I heard a whisper in a dream," she said. "A voice that said, 'Go east. There, the gods do not watch. There, someone remembers the forgotten.'" His breath caught in his throat. "And when I arrived," she added, "I saw you." They said nothing after that. There were no words needed, just silence, and the soft weight of memory finally settling, not as a burden, but as something sacred. Something shared. The stars above shifted slowly, and beneath them, Senu and Neferu sat together at the edge of the firelight, no longer hiding, no longer alone. Of course. Here's part 12 of the story. In the silence of the desert night, with only the stars glinting faintly above the expanse of ancient sands, we return once more to the hidden world behind the glimmering facade of Egyptian royalty. Part 12 now opens, as we leave behind the broken innocence of youthful heirs and step into the perfumed corridors of divine unions, marriages not of passion, but of prophecy and power. In these gilded halls, the concept of love was a stranger. while duty sat heavily upon the shoulders of queens and pharaohs alike. A new pharaoh had ascended, his name lost now to history, for the line of divine kings often bore near identical names, repeating themselves like shadows under the sun. But this pharaoh, youthful and newly crowned, had been raised in the shadows of incense and ritual, and now stood draped in gold and lapis, searching for his next step. And the high priests, always close behind the throne, whispered to him that the gods demanded a sacred union, one of blood, one of faith. And so it was decreed the pharaoh would marry his sister. To modern ears, such a proclamation would stir discomfort. But in the traditions of Kemet, where gods were born of siblings and perpetuated their rule through sacred incest, the custom was revered. The story told was not one of scandal, but of divine symmetry. Osiris and Isis, Shu and Tefnut, brother and sister, twin souls walking the eternal path. By mirroring the gods, the pharaoh reaffirmed his holiness. Yet behind the poetic veil lay trembling hearts and clenched hands. The sister bride, still scarcely a woman, was pulled from her private chambers and sewn into a gown of gold threads. Her hair, perfumed and oiled, was braided in heavy coils that tugged at her scalp. Jewels dangled from her ears, and the weight of the crown bruised her brow. She did not weep. No, that would have been seen. But her fingers, hidden beneath the folds of her ceremonial robe, trembled. She knew this was not her choice. It was her role. Like the sacred white cows led up the temple steps, or the baskets of lotus offered to the gods. The marriage ceremony was held beneath the painted ceilings of the Amun temple in Thebes. Candles flickered in the thick, warm air. Incense rose in spirals, dizzying in its sweetness. The priests chanted in deep, sonorous tones, and the sacred oils were anointed on foreheads and wrists. From afar, the union seemed beautiful, etched in holiness and divine light. But in truth, the girl flinched as the pharaoh approached, and he too, beneath his kohl-lined eyes, bore a look not of triumph but of silent resignation. He had loved another, a servant's daughter he had met in the gardens. But love was not for kings, only symbols. Their union marked the beginning of a reign cloaked in rituals and sacrifice. Every morning, the new queen was required to offer milk to the gods in the temple's inner sanctum, her presence a constant reminder that the bloodline of the gods flowed unbroken. Every evening, she was veiled and paraded through the palace, a divine image meant to inspire devotion and awe in all who beheld her. But inside the queen's heart, shadows grew. She dreamed often of escape. In the heat of the night, while her husband lay restless beside her, she would imagine a small boat drifting silently down the Nile, away from the temples and the ever-watching eyes. Sometimes she would remember the time before the crown, before the gold, before the heavy silences. She would recall laughter and running barefoot across the courtyards and the taste of fresh pomegranates. And yet she never fled. To do so would be to break not just laws, but the order of the cosmos. For in Egypt, the pharaoh and his queen were more than human. They were the axis upon which Ma'at, the sacred balance, rested. If the queen abandoned her role, she would doom the kingdom to chaos. The Nile would dry, the sun would falter, and the dead would be lost in the Duat. So she stayed. She played her role. And the pharaoh, too, did what was expected. He took concubines, bore children, and stood beside his queen in festivals where flowers rained from balconies and the people cheered their divine rulers. But beneath the surface, the marriage eroded. He rarely spoke to her. When he did, it was in formal tones, like an actor in a play. She responded with the same cold precision. They lived beside each other as strangers, performing their sacred drama for the court, the gods, and the people. And none dared question it. Among the priests, however, there were whispers. They saw the queen's eyes drifting too often to the horizon. They noticed her lone walks in the gardens at night. And the chief of the high priests, a man named Senum, began to worry that the queen might break. He arranged for sacred tablets to be recited in her chamber, verses reminding her of her destiny, of the fate of women who strayed from Ma'at. Tales of queens who defied the gods and were turned to stone, or cast into the desert to wander as wailing spirits. And though she listened in silence, her heart rebelled. But rebellion in Egypt was never loud. It came not with swords, but with silence, with secrets, with quiet acts beneath the notice of kings. One day, a letter was found beneath a pillar in the queen's private temple. a letter in her handwriting, though never addressed. It read, "I am bound in gold, but the chains still chafe. I speak to the gods, but they do not answer. My name is sung by 1,000 mouths, yet I feel unseen. If I am the image of Isis, then where is my Osiris?" The letter was never spoken of publicly. It was burned by Sinem, who feared its power. But the priests began to watch her more closely, and so the palace became a quiet prison. The queen's laughter faded. The pharaoh grew colder. Their children were raised by nurses and scribes, schooled in the ways of divine detachment. And the kingdom? It continued. The Nile flooded. Crops bloomed. Statues were raised. From the outside, all was well. But inside the hearts of those who wore the crowns, a different story was being etched. A story of longing, silence, and the slow erosion of self beneath the weight of divine expectations. In time, the queen died young. Her cause of death was never written. Her sarcophagus bore no signs of illness, no wounds, just the serene face of a woman who had borne her role with grace and gone silently into the arms of the gods. She was buried beside her husband, in a tomb so ornate that even the stars seemed to bow before it. But among the hidden chambers of that tomb, carved into a stone no one was meant to see, was a single line. "May the soul of the queen find the freedom the crown denied her." And so, the story of divine unions reminds us that even beneath the gold and the glory, hearts still beat. And sometimes, they break in silence. The passage of time in ancient Egypt was not counted merely in years or in reigns, but in cycles of the Nile, eclipses of the moon, and the quiet erosion of stone beneath relentless sand. And as the dust settled over the tomb of the queen, whose heart had longed for freedom beneath the burden of a golden crown, a new chapter unfolded, a tale steeped in silence, shadows, and the unsettling presence of the dead among the living. Pharaohs were not only rulers of the land, they were custodians of eternity. And in this, their relationship with death was unlike that of any other people in the ancient world. Where other cultures feared it, the Egyptians orchestrated its arrival like a grand ritual, a journey to be prepared for, not avoided. But what they could not prepare for, what they dared not name aloud, was when the dead returned. This part of our tale begins with a strange occurrence deep within the Valley of the Kings. The sun had just dipped beneath the limestone cliffs, casting long, golden shadows across the desert. A group of workers, tasked with expanding a hidden burial chamber, discovered something unusual, a narrow tunnel behind a false wall. It was not on any map, nor inscribed with the customary protective spells. It led downward, steep and cramped, carved in haste, as though someone had meant to conceal it forever. The overseer, a seasoned man named Harwa, ordered torches lit and descended, his breath thick with unease. The air within the tunnel was cold, unnatural, as if time itself had been halted within its narrow confines. As they moved deeper, the workers began to whisper of a smell, sweet yet cloying, like perfume gone sour. And then they found it. A second chamber, empty of treasures, bare of inscriptions. In its center lay a stone bier, and upon it a coffin unlike any seen before. It was small, too small for a pharaoh. But its craftsmanship was exquisite, inlaid with crushed garnet and obsidian, and bearing no name. When Harwa reached out to touch it, the torches flickered violently. A gust of wind, impossible in the sealed space, swept through the chamber, extinguishing every flame in an instant. The men fled, stumbling in darkness, abandoning their tools and each other. Word of the discovery spread swiftly, not through official scrolls, but in hushed voices over pots of beer and bread at twilight. And soon, it reached the ears of the young pharaoh's court, a court already steeped in whispers of curses, of omens, of queens who wept from beyond the veil. The high priest Senem, now older, bent with time but still wielding fear like a blade, demanded the chamber be sealed. But the pharaoh, curious and proud, refused. He ordered the chamber be opened in full daylight, and that the coffin be brought to the palace. That night, dreams plagued the palace. Servants screamed in their sleep. Guards claimed to see a woman in white gliding silently down the corridors. And the royal scribe, a man devoted to reason and logic, was found dead in his chambers, his eyes wide open, his fingers clenched around a reed pen that had snapped in half. The coffin, now housed in the temple of Anubis for examination, revealed its occupant at last. It was a girl, no older than 16, her body perfectly preserved, as though she had fallen into slumber rather than death. She wore a golden circlet, and her lips were tinted still with the residue of ochre pigment. But no records named her. No royal seal marked her coffin. And yet, those who looked upon her felt something deep and ancient stir within them. The pharaoh, troubled by the events, summoned the wisest seer in all of Thebes, a woman named Thea, who spoke seldom and lived in solitude beyond the city. She arrived at the temple, dressed in woven reeds, her hair long and streaked with ash, her eyes clouded by cataracts, but her voice, when she spoke, silenced the room. "This girl," she whispered, placing her hand upon the coffin, "was not meant to be remembered." A hush fell. She continued, slower now, as though reaching into realms beyond sight. She was the daughter of a forgotten king, hidden from the world, buried alive beneath lies. Gasps rose among the priests. One stepped forward, demanding proof. But Thea merely bowed her head and placed a papyrus scroll beside the coffin. None could read it. It was written in a hand more ancient than the current dynasty, its script looping and jagged like the crests of a snake. But the image at its center was unmistakable, a pharaoh kneeling before a girl child, her eyes covered, her mouth sewn shut. That night, the air thickened with dread. Bells clanged in the temple towers, though no hand had rung them. In the burial room, the golden circlet slipped from the girl's brow, as if pushed by unseen fingers. And at the palace, the pharaoh began to change. He grew pale. His voice faltered in ceremony. He wandered the halls at night, muttering to himself in tongues forgotten. He spoke of dreams where he stood before a throne of blood, and a girl with sewn lips reached out to him, her fingers made of bone. The priests begged for the coffin to be returned to the earth. Senum wept openly, a rare sight, warning that they had breached a seal not meant to be broken. But the pharaoh refused. He believed he was meant to know her story, that he was bound to it. And so, scrolls were unsealed, tombs re-examined. In fragments of old stone and broken statuary, a truth began to emerge. There had once been a daughter born to a great king during the years of drought. Her birth was hidden, for the omens surrounding her were grim. Cats howled for days, the Nile refused to rise, and even the sun dimmed at midday. The priests declared her cursed, but the king, unwilling to kill his own blood, ordered her placed in a hidden tomb with food, gold, and prayers, and left her to the gods. Some say she lived for days in that darkness. Some say she still walks between this world and the next. And now, her story had returned. The pharaoh, driven by obsession or guilt or divine madness, locked himself in the burial room for 3 nights. When he emerged, he bore a mark upon his chest, a handprint burned into flesh, and he issued a new decree that the girl be buried with royal honors beside the most sacred of tombs, and her name inscribed at last, though none knew it. But as the tomb was sealed and the final prayers chanted, the skies darkened and the desert winds began to howl. Some say she was appeased. Others say her tale is not yet done. And beneath the sands, far from the light, something ancient stirred once more. Beneath the veils of silence that blanketed the kingdom, a change began to ripple, not in thunder, but in whispers, as though the very stones of the temples had begun to murmur. The burial of the unnamed girl, once dismissed as a forgotten anomaly, had awakened something in the air itself. The priests, long accustomed to managing the seen and unseen, found their rituals faltering, their incense failing to rise cleanly, their dreams no longer clear. And so, part 14 of our tale opens in the southern precinct of the great temple of Karnak, where the sacred lake lay still and black beneath the moonlight. Here, once a month, the chief oracle, selected not for wisdom but for purity of lineage and silence of soul, would perform the rite of waters, communing with the gods through reflection and song. On this night, however, the waters gave back no reflection. The oracle, a boy of no more than 14, stood trembling at the edge. The chant on his lips faltered, and those who watched from behind the columns saw the fire in his torch hiss and die, though no wind stirred. Then the boy dropped to his knees, crying out a single word: "She remembers." He was carried away, senseless and burning with fever. He would never speak again. Word of the event swept swiftly through the ranks of priests and scholars, and it did not take long for the whispers to reach the ears of Pharaoh. His own nights had not been quiet. Since the burial of the nameless girl, his dreams had turned vivid and terrible. Visions of hollow halls filled with sand, of figures with painted faces weeping without sound, of eyes watching from beneath linen shrouds. He would wake breathless, heart hammering, only to find the scent of lotus thick in the air, though none had been burned. The high priest Senum, who now leaned heavily upon a cane carved with prayers against chaos, approached the pharaoh in private. "It is the blood," he said, voice hoarse and thin. "The blood of the forgotten has been disturbed. She was not alone." This, more than any omen, unsettled the pharaoh. In response, he summoned the royal necromancer, a figure so rarely seen that many thought him myth. His name was Nebu-Akhet, and he came not from the temple ranks, but from the outer deserts, where the dead were said to speak in riddles through cracked rocks and scorched bones. He arrived swathed in white linen, his face veiled, carrying with him a jar of dust and a carved obsidian mirror, said to show not reflections, but truths. Nebu-Akhet examined the burial chamber, the scroll left by the seer Thea, and finally, the dreams described by the pharaoh. He did not speak for 3 days, fasting beneath the statues of the gods. On the 4th, he painted a circle of red ochre around the throne and placed the pharaoh at its center. Then he spoke. The girl was not a curse. She was a seal. The chamber fell silent. A seal placed by desperate hands to hold back what once walked freely. Her burial was a pact. Her silence was the bond. And you, Pharaoh, have broken it. The words fell like stones into still water. Senum, once bold, recoiled. Even the guards at the door shifted uneasily, gripping their spears. But the pharaoh, pale and grim, only nodded. "What comes now?" he asked. Nebu-Akhet gestured to the obsidian mirror. "Now we prepare." He explained that the disturbance had awakened not merely a spirit, but an echo of something older than dynasty, something bound to the land when gods still walked upon it and men spoke in fire and dust. It had no name in the current tongue, only symbols. A black sun, a coiled serpent, an eye weeping blood. It had once ruled not from a throne, but from beneath the earth. Not with laws, but with dreams. And it remembered. The pharaoh, no longer certain whether he ruled or merely waited, withdrew from public sight. He ceased attending ceremonies. His statues, once carved with outstretched arms and radiant crowns, began appearing with their hands folded, heads bowed. The people noticed, and they grew fearful. They asked questions in the markets, whispered behind palm-thatched doors. Had the gods turned away? Had the dead grown stronger than the living? Meanwhile, preparations began beneath the palace. Hidden rooms were opened, chambers sealed since the Old Kingdom. In one, beneath layers of plaster and centuries of dust, they uncovered a chamber with walls painted in thick red, scenes of a city drowned in sand, of stars falling from the sky, of men and women walking with their eyes sewn shut. Here Nebu-Akhet began to work. He called upon the oldest rituals, rites not found in temple scrolls, but remembered in the marrow of bones. He burned herbs no longer named, chanted syllables that cracked the voice. And slowly the veil thinned. The pharaoh was brought nightly into this chamber, and there, in darkness, he confronted visions. Not mere dreams, but lives. Memories not his own, flooding his senses with strange scents and foreign skies. He saw a kingdom beneath the desert, made not of stone but of thought. He saw a king with no face, only a crown made of screams. And he saw himself, or someone wearing his face, kneeling before that crown. Each night he emerged weaker, but more determined. He ordered statues of the old gods torn down and replaced with empty pillars. He commanded that the prayers be rewritten, no longer in praise, but in remembrance, not of the divine, but of the forgotten. And he called for the tombs of every unnamed child buried near the Valley of the Kings to be exhumed. It was a command that sent shock through every corner of the kingdom. These were not acts of reverence. These were not the deeds of a pious ruler. These were signs, clear, dire, and disturbing, that the line between past and present, between life and what lies beyond it, had begun to blur. And so, beneath a moonless sky, the tombs were opened. One by one, each child's resting place disturbed, not for riches, but for remembrance. Their names were chiseled into stone, their bones wrapped in new linen. Offerings were placed beside them, milk, honey, and small toys carved in cedar. And with each tomb opened, the dreams grew darker, for now it seemed the dead had begun to listen. Far from the grandeur of the palace and the rituals of the high temples, there existed a quieter Egypt, one not sung of in hymns nor carved into the stone reliefs. It was the Egypt of shepherds and weavers, of reedcraft and fish netting, of grandmothers who whispered stories by firelight. And in this Egypt, the people felt the change. Their dreams were no longer safe. They spoke of waking in the middle of the night, lungs burning as though they'd swallowed sand. Of wandering down paths in their sleep and returning with feet caked in mud. Children cried of a girl with closed eyes who asked them questions in languages they couldn't name, and some never woke at all. Their hearts stopped, not by blade nor illness, but by something colder, something ancient. Part 15 begins here, in the village of Perneb, a humble place nestled between lotus-covered ponds and rust-colored hills. Here, an old woman named Amira lived in a house of sun-dried brick, where she kept bees and told stories to children whose parents toiled in the fields. She had seen many pharaohs come and go, and though the scrolls of the palace had forgotten her name, the people had not. When the dreams began to spread like sickness, the villagers came to her door in the night, clutching woven charms and asking questions with trembling voices. Why is this happening? Why won't the gods answer? Amira, blind in one eye and bent by time, stirred her honeyed tea and listened. And finally she spoke, because they were never meant to sleep. The villagers fell silent, as though the air itself had stiffened. She told them of the time before time, when the world had not yet chosen a shape, when thought and dust and spirit mingled without distinction. There were no gods then, only powers, some bright, some bitter. And among them was a silence so vast, so still, that even the stars dared not whisper in its presence. It was this silence, she claimed, that the pharaoh had awakened. Meanwhile, in the palace at Waset, the pharaoh wandered his chambers like a man hunted by his own thoughts. His council sat vacant, his wives cloistered away. Only Nebu-Akhet remained near, and even he had begun to wear amulets sewn into his robe and speak in careful riddles, as if naming things aloud might give them form. The dreams had worsened. Now the pharaoh no longer saw just the faceless king, the drowned city, the bleeding eye. He began to dream of himself, his hands wrinkled, his eyes blackened, his voice chanting in a language that made the statues crack. He dreamed of standing atop a ziggurat of bones, speaking to the sun and commanding it to flee. He would wake, shaking and soaked in sweat, his linen sheets damp with a scent that was not his own. Yet with each vision, something hardened within him. It was no longer fear that filled his heart, but resolve, a terrible, lonely clarity. He summoned the scribes and ordered the composition of a new text, one to be etched not on papyrus, but upon the stone walls of a chamber yet to be built, a chamber without windows, without light, buried deep beneath the earth. This text was not a prayer. It was a warning. It began, "To those who come after know this. There are doors which must never open, and names which must never pass the lips of the living." The scribes, disturbed by the task, obeyed in silence. Some wept as they carved. One gouged out his own eyes after the 7th stanza, muttering only, "She watches." Elsewhere in the kingdom, statues began to weep. Not with water, but with dust. Eyes carved in obsidian or painted in lapis began to erode, not by time, but by something unseen. And in their place, smooth hollows remained. Temples where hymns were sung echoed with a second voice, low, tremulous, and impossible to trace. Offerings left upon altars were found spoiled before sunrise. The milk curdled, the bread hard as stone. The priests no longer dared enter the inner sanctums alone. Back in Perneb, Amira lit a small fire and whispered into the flames. She spoke not to the gods of the temple, but to the old ones, the ones whose names were not written. Her fingers traced symbols into the ash, swirls, serpents, and stars, and she wept. "Let them forget," she said softly. "Let them forget before remembering becomes their ruin." But it was too late. The pharaoh had ordered the construction of the House of Descent. This was to be a place where the veil would be studied, not honored. A vast subterranean complex deeper than any tomb, shielded from light and time. Here, the dreams would be mapped, the echoes listened to, the silence measured. And here, he believed, he could find the origin of the visions, perhaps even bargain with it, command it if necessary. He would be the last dreamer, he told himself. He would carry the weight of this awakening alone. But Nebu-Akhet warned him gently, the one who descends is not always the one who returns. Still, the pharaoh would not yield. The first stone of the House of Descent was laid beneath the full moon, with blood instead of wine, with silence instead of song. No chants, no drums, only a breath held in the throat of the kingdom. And as the stone touched the earth, a tremor passed unseen across the desert. Far in the north, in a temple long abandoned, a statue cracked from crown to base, releasing from its hollow heart a single sealed scroll. It bore no name, only the mark of a coiled serpent devouring the sun. And so, as the sands shifted and the dreams deepened, the line between memory and prophecy thinned. The pharaoh had begun his descent, but what waited below had long been rising. The first descent into the house of descent was not marked by grand fanfare or ceremonial procession, but by silence so profound it seemed the very walls of Waset held their breath. The entrance had been carved beneath a forgotten wing of the palace, sealed behind 7 doors, each inscribed not with blessings but with warnings, phrases etched in haste and fervor, repeating one singular plea: do not look back. At the center of it all stood the pharaoh, his figure diminished, his shoulders bowed not from age but from knowing. He no longer wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Instead, his brow was bare, save for a single thread of red linen knotted above his third eye, a mark of humility before the unknown. With him descended a small group: Nebu Akhet, the veiled necromancer whose breath now came in wheezes, a mute priestess, chosen for her inability to name what she might see, and 3 scribes who had sworn oaths never to speak again outside the chamber. The passage wound downward like the body of a serpent, tight, unlit, with walls that seemed to sweat and breathe. As they descended, the temperature shifted unnaturally. It was not colder, nor warmer, but elsewhere. The kind of air one finds in deep tombs where time has forgotten to move. It was days before they reached the first antechamber. Here, the pharaoh ordered their torches extinguished. Instead, they lit braziers with oil said to be rendered from the sap of the sycamore that grew near forgotten graves. The flame burned violet, casting flickering shadows against the walls, which bore no paintings, no reliefs, only indentations, as if once living fingers had pressed into the stone from within. At the heart of the chamber was a dais, and upon it a stone mask. Its face was neither man nor god. Its features were smoothed to abstraction, save for the eyes, hollow voids that seemed to drink in the light. The mute priestess collapsed upon seeing it, convulsing in silence, foam bubbling at the corners of her mouth. The scribes clutched their styluses, too afraid to move. Nebu Akhet stepped forward, his veil trembling, and whispered something no one recorded. The pharaoh approached and touched the mask, and in that moment, the dream ceased. Not only for him, but across the kingdom. The nightly visitations stopped. The children no longer spoke of the weeping girl. The statues no longer shed dust. It was as if the breath held by Egypt for so long was finally exhaled. But peace did not follow. In the towns and fields, people forgot how to sleep. Not for lack of fatigue, but because sleep would not come. They lay still, hour after hour, their eyes wide, their minds circling unspoken fears. The body craved rest, yet the soul refused to drift. Even the animals, oxen, hounds, jackals, howled through the dark, restless and trembling. And so it was that Egypt entered the time of the waking death. Priests blamed the stars, scribes revised the calendars. But the truth, whispered only in the back rooms of perfumed shrines, was this: the pharaoh had gone too far. He had touched what should have remained unspoken. Beneath the palace, in the chamber of the mask, the descent continued. The mask had revealed a second tunnel, hidden beneath the dais. Not carved by hands, but formed as if the earth itself had been torn open in offering. Nebu Akhet, whose body had begun to wither, refused to go further. He remained above, chanting day and night, his voice cracking into dust. The pharaoh pressed on alone, save for one scribe, a youth named Taheru, whose dreams had always been empty, who had never heard a voice, seen a vision, or felt the touch of a forgotten god. "Your silence makes you fit," the pharaoh had said. They descended into the belly of the earth, beyond even the reach of firelight. Here, the stone changed. It grew dark and damp, not with water, but with memory, a clinging, sentient residue that seemed to whisper when touched. And then they reached the chamber of the second silence. It was vast, spherical, and utterly still. In its center stood a pillar of polished black stone, so smooth and cold it seemed to throb with a pulse not its own. Around it, carvings, shapes not of man or beast, but of concepts: grief, hunger, silence, and something deeper than death. The pharaoh stood before it and whispered a name, not his, not hers, but its. And then the pillar bloomed, not with light, but with absence, an unfolding of darkness so complete that Teheru screamed and dropped his stylus, his voice lost in the vacuum. The pharaoh, eyes wide but tearless, stepped forward into it, vanishing with a breath. Teheru fled. He climbed in blindness, his mind fractured, his mouth open in a soundless scream. He emerged days later, aged beyond recognition, his skin sallow, his hair streaked white. He could not speak. He would never write again. But his eyes, when opened, showed not terror, but reverence. And still the pharaoh did not return. Above, the city was unraveling. The nobles, denied counsel or clarity, began to flee. The temples burned incense day and night, desperate to coax the gods back into memory. The common folk began to build cairns to nameless deities, placing teeth, hair, and old bones inside, hoping to ward off the insomnia that gnawed at their lives. No one dreamed. No one rested, but they remembered. They remembered her, though no name was spoken. They remembered the girl with closed eyes. They remembered the whispering tomb. They remembered the seal, now broken. And still the house of descent stood, silent and unmoving, a wound in the earth that pulsed with the breath of something old, something waiting. And somewhere far below the surface, in a place where sound could not reach and light had never lived, the pharaoh stood once more, face to face with the dark that dreams had tried to forget. In the deepest place man had ever dared to tread, far beneath the sands, beneath the palace, beneath the bones of forgotten empires, there was no light, no sound, and no time. This was not a tomb nor a chamber. It was a fold in reality, a hollow in the world's breath. And here, in a place so removed from life that even death did not fully dwell, stood the pharaoh. His robes were no longer the linen of kings, but were damp with the sweat of fear and awe. His feet, bare now, touched not earth, but something smoother, something colder than stone. It was not a floor, it was awareness, ancient, quiet, and vast. Behind him, the long descent had vanished. The path he had taken no longer existed. Ahead, the space trembled with possibilities. There was no architecture here, no walls or ceiling, only a great enveloping void softly pulsing like the underside of a heartbeat. It was not entirely dark, for there was a faint glow, dim, colorless, but steady, radiating from the space itself. It illuminated nothing. It simply was, and in that stillness, something watched. The pharaoh felt it not with his eyes, but with his blood. A presence surrounded him, old beyond language, beyond the reach of even the gods. He, the divine ruler of the two lands, who had held the crook and flail, who had walked through incense and song, felt himself as small as dust. Then they came, not as figures, not as people. They were impressions, like heat rippling across stone, like memory caught in glass. Shifts in the air that resembled a face, a sound, a moment, a mother humming to a child, a priest tearing linen, a cry buried underwater. These fragments circled the pharaoh, drawn to his breath, his pulse. Not menacing, but curious. Not welcoming, but expectant. And then she appeared. The girl. She did not enter. She did not arrive. She was simply there, as if she had always been, and only now was seen. Her eyes remained shut, stitched still with golden thread. Her feet did not touch the unseen floor. Her robes, once royal, now seemed woven from mist and memory. Yet her presence dwarfed all others. She was not a spirit, nor a shade. She was a seal, and the pharaoh understood. He had called her forth, not through summoning rites, but through his descent, through the piercing of silence, the breaking of sleep, the naming of the unnamed. He had breached the bond she had held alone for centuries, perhaps millennia, a bond forged not of chains or stone, but of will and sacrifice. She raised a hand, not in threat, not in command, but in offering. The pharaoh, whose name had once echoed across river and temple, knelt, and in that moment he saw. He saw the world before memory, a land of shifting forms and wandering thoughts, where gods had not yet learned names and men had not yet learned fear. A time when creation trembled and slumbered within the mind of the void, and in that stillness something had awoken, a thought too wide, too deep, too cruel. It had no body, only hunger, no voice, only echo. It had entered the minds of dreamers, cracked the bones of oracles, and slipped into the words of children. And to hold it back, the first of the binders was born, a girl, not made by gods but chosen by something deeper. She had been silence incarnate, a vessel of stillness into which the noise of that ancient hunger could be sealed. Her life had been short, her death deliberate, her tomb a prison, her dreams the walls. And now the pharaoh had broken her sleep. He felt it in his blood, the pressure of the forgotten pressing in, rising like water through cracks. And yet she did not condemn him. She reached out further, and when he took her hand, the gold thread upon her lips unraveled. A breath escaped her mouth, a single sigh that trembled through the fold and across the desert sands, up through the layers of stone, into the air above. And the world changed. Above, in Waset, the stars shifted. The constellations, long fixed, shuddered into new forms. The sacred ibis flew without formation. Dogs howled in harmony with winds that did not exist. And the Nile surged unnaturally, retreating from its banks as if recoiling from something unseen. But the people, at last found sleep. They collapsed into dreams heavy with relief. Their breath steadied, their hearts slowed. The terror that had stalked their nights ebbed like a tide pulling back to sea. In Perneb, old Amira slept for the first time in months, and in her sleep she wept. For in her dream, a little girl with closed eyes kissed her forehead and whispered, "Thank you." In the necropolis, the bones of the forgotten children were still. No longer restless, no longer waiting. Their spirits curled into themselves like lotus petals at dusk. The priests, too, slept beside altars, their hands slack, their lips parted in wordless gratitude. And deep beneath it all, the pharaoh stood, still holding the girl's hand. The space around them had changed. No longer the oppressive void, it now shimmered with soft lines, as if reality itself was sewing itself anew. The darkness retreated. Not banished, but cradled, contained, willingly. She would remain. She would mend the seal, not as a prisoner, but as guardian. But she would not stand alone. The pharaoh, whose name would be struck from all stone, all scroll, all memory, had chosen to stay. Together they became the twin sentinels of silence, no longer forgotten, no longer dreaming. And from that day forward, the line of pharaohs would bear no memory of him. His name would vanish, his likeness would dissolve, but the land would remember, in quiet sleep, in gentle dreams. And sometimes when the wind whispered through reeds at dusk, or when a child stirred from slumber with a smile and no fear, the people would say, "Rest has returned." And though no statue bore his face, no prayer bore her name, they would endure, beneath, together. In the years that followed the pharaoh's vanishing, Egypt entered a strange season, a period neither marked by war nor famine, nor by great construction or discovery, but by a hush that lingered in every corner of the kingdom. The scribes would later call it Sep Chenu, the time of quiet blessings. But among the common people, it was simply remembered as the time of deep sleep. Dream returned to the land, not the frenzied visions that had once plagued the kingdom, but a gentle, nourishing kind of sleep. Children slept through the night and woke humming melodies no one had taught them. Old men dozed in the shade of tamarisk trees and whispered names that were not their own. Even the animals, cats, oxen, birds, lay still for hours, unbothered by wind or fly. Yet within this peace, a question lingered. What had truly happened to the pharaoh? No decree had announced his death. No tomb had been built. No successor immediately rose. The royal court, stunned and rudderless, awaited direction. The priests maintained ceremonies as best they could, speaking his name in daily rites until it faded from their tongues. In time, it simply disappeared. And when the scribes finally returned to their scrolls to record the lineage of kings, they left a blank space, a deliberate absence, a silence as sacred as a name. But not all had forgotten. One among them remembered, not in dreams, nor in whispered lore, but in the blood that pulsed behind his eyes. He was a child born of uncertain parentage, taken in by temple attendants after being found asleep at the foot of the gate of Karnak one crisp morning. His skin bore strange markings, pale spirals that circled his wrists and temples like the coils of an ancient script. They called him Bak Amun, though he responded to no name for the first 3 years of his life. He rarely spoke, rarely cried, but he watched, always watching. And when he did speak, his first word was not a name nor a plea. It was, he stayed. The priests grew uneasy. They brought forth scrolls, invoked protective spells, tried to banish whatever dream clung to the boy, but nothing changed him. His eyes remained deep, his silence potent. By the age of 10, he had memorized the names of all the gods, known and lost. By 15, he could walk blindfolded through the sacred passages of the temple without once losing his step. He would later tell a high priest, "The walls remember, I only follow." As Egypt slumbered in peaceful stillness, Bakamun awoke to memory, not his own, but passed to him like a secret gift. He would sit by the temple's reflecting pool at dusk and whisper verses from forgotten scripts, invoking not the names of deities, but of ideas, balance, silence, threshold, thread. And the priests began to listen. In the silence that had descended upon the land, words regained their weight. What was once said without thought was now spoken with reverence. People no longer cried out in idle curses. Children were taught not only what to say, but when to remain quiet, and in that quiet they began to hear faintly, beneath the hush of the reeds or the rustle of linen at night, a voice. Not a voice like thunder, not a command, but a breath, a presence. Bakamun called it the deep thread. He explained in words that seemed too ancient for one so young that what had once been sealed now chose to rest, not out of force, but of will. He told them that two had stayed behind to keep the world whole, not with chains, but with understanding. And it was their peace that now blanketed the land. The elders asked how he knew, and Bakamun only smiled. I dream what they choose to forget. Years passed, he came of age, but he took no title. He refused the high seat in the temple, declined wealth and robes. He chose to live among the reeds at the river's bend, in a small house woven of papyrus and ashwood. Yet kings sought his counsel, and when he spoke, they listened. Because the sleep of Egypt remained undisturbed. No invasions came, no plagues fell, no curses stirred. In his dreams, Bakamun walked the corridors beneath the palace, though they had long since been sealed. He passed through walls no longer real, entered rooms shaped by thought and silence, and always, at the end of the path, he found them. The pharaoh, the girl. They stood together before the pillar, not aged, not changed, but ever watchful. He never approached, never spoke. He simply watched, and they in turn watched him. And once, just once, the girl opened her mouth, not stitched, not closed, and whispered, "The breath must continue." Bakamun woke with tears upon his cheeks. He returned to Karnak that day and had carved upon a hidden wall within the inner sanctum a single phrase, "The seal is peace. The peace is choice. The choice was love." No one ever erased it. He died at the age of 77, his body discovered seated upright by the Nile, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as if whispering to the water. No illness had claimed him. No wound. The physicians could not explain it. But the villagers who found him said the reeds around his body had grown tall and bloomed in perfect symmetry, 7 to each side, arching gently above him like wings. They buried him without stone, without statue. Only a papyrus slip was left atop his heart, bearing a single word, remember. And though the pharaoh's name was lost and the girls never spoken, their story lived in dreams, passed from sleeper to sleeper, in lullabies hummed by mothers who didn't know why the tune soothed them, in the sighs of old men who found peace before death, and in the quiet between raindrops when the sky seemed to hold its breath and listen. In the soft embrace of centuries long turned to dust, Egypt lived on, quiet, slumbering beneath the golden weight of time. The pharaoh who had vanished was not spoken of, not remembered in the temples or carved upon the obelisks. His name, once carried by the wind through fields of barley and lotus groves, was gone. Yet still something stirred. It began subtly, as changes often do. A ripple in the night air, the way animals paused at dusk and listened toward the horizon. The stars, which had long walked predictable paths across the sky, began to shift ever so slightly. The sacred triangle of Sopdet, Sa, and Horus no longer shone where they should. Priests whispered that perhaps the gods were writing new stories in the sky, stories not yet meant to be read. Among the people, dreams had changed. For generations, sleep had been sweet and untroubled, an inheritance from a sacrifice long forgotten. But now, across the Delta and up the Nile, in hamlets and cities, people began to dream not of rest, but of images, shapes, words, sounds, too strange and vivid to ignore. A potter in Hut Harib woke each morning with sand beneath her eyelids. A child in Dendera spoke in a language none recognized, a tongue soft and ancient, curling like incense smoke. A shepherd near the Red Land said he saw 2 figures in his dreams standing hand in hand in a place with no sky and no time. Always, they stood in silence. Always, the dream ended with a single word, whispered, just as waking pulled him free, soon. These visions reached the ears of a woman named Nekhet, once a scholar at the Great Library of On, now aged and half forgotten. Her eyes were cloudy, but her mind sharp. She had studied forbidden texts in her youth, scrolls that described the old ways before the gods wore names, before dreams were safe. She heard of the dreams returning, and her heart stirred with both wonder and dread. She began to travel again, slow and bent, but with purpose. In Memphis, she listened to a mason speak of a dream where he floated above a lake made of stars. In Abydos, a singer wept after seeing a golden thread coiled around the moon. In Sais, a dying priest whispered the name Bak Amun before his final breath, a name not spoken in decades, known only in whispers, remembered only in sleep. In each town, Netket took notes, not on papyrus but in her mind, etched deep with care. What she saw forming was not madness, not plague, but memory, rising like mist from the tomb of time. And then, in Waset, within the shadows of the palace ruins, she found a room. It should not have existed. The walls bore no records of it. It lay behind a crumbling column, revealed only when a storm split the outer stone. Inside, there were no statues, no carvings, no sacred emblems. Only a single sentence cut into the smooth, undressed wall. To forget was mercy. To remember is choice. She stood before those words for a long time, her hand trembling as it touched the letters. She knew what this was. The seal, once closed by silence, had begun to breathe. That night, in her dreams, she saw him. Not clearly, not in fullness. Just a silhouette, tall, still, standing before a vast shadow that trembled like water. At his side was the girl, no longer a child. Her eyes were open now, her gaze calm and infinite. She did not speak. She only placed a hand on the man's shoulder. And in that gesture, Netket understood. They had not sealed the darkness out of fear, but out of love. The world had not been ready then, not ready to bear the weight of what slept beneath thought. The darkness was not evil, it was deep. And depth, misunderstood, becomes terror. The Pharaoh had stayed not to fight, but to wait, to give the world time to grow wise. And now, perhaps, that time was near. When Netket woke, she wept, not out of sorrow, but out of a strange, trembling awe. She spent her final days near the banks of the Nile, gathering her thoughts into a single scroll. She sealed it in clay and buried it beneath a sycamore tree at sunrise, whispering a prayer to the wind. Its final lines read, "They held it for us, not from us, and when we are ready, they will not speak. They will listen." And Egypt continued quietly. The dreams deepened, the stars shifted further. And children across the land began to hum the same tune in their sleep, a melody no one had taught them, a song without words, old as silence. It echoed through open windows, through reeds and dust, across water and wind. They did not know its meaning, but the girl did, and beneath the earth, beyond the fold, she listened. The Pharaoh at her side, their vigil unbroken, not as jailers, but as guardians, not in fear, but in hope. For the day when all would remember and no longer need to forget. In the 20th part of this long dream tale, the wind shifts again, this time from the desert toward the sea, carrying with it a quiet knowledge, the kind that gathers slowly like the silt at the bottom of the Nile. Egypt, ancient and enduring, now stood on the precipice of something unseen. Not destruction, but unveiling. The dreams had become a tide. No longer scattered across isolated villages or whispered by lone children, they now moved through the hearts of thousands. Scribes began waking with the urge to write verses they did not remember learning. Midwives hummed lullabies older than any known language. Farmers, kneeling in their fields, found tears in their eyes without knowing why. And it was not grief that stirred them, but recognition. Something long hidden was drawing near, not through force, not through conquest, but through shared remembering. At the great temple of Ipet Isut in Thebes, the high priestess Heneret, a woman of profound silence and deep listening, summoned her most trusted attendants. They had each dreamed of the same place for 7 consecutive nights. A corridor of black stone, lined with mirrors that did not reflect their faces, but scenes from lives not their own. And in each dream, at the end of the corridor, stood 2 figures, one cloaked in gold that did not gleam, the other wrapped in linen that breathed. Always together, always watching. And in every dream, they spoke no words. They only opened a door. The priestess believed these visions were not messages, but invitations. Not commands, but offerings. And so, guided by her dreams, Heneret began to organize a sacred remembrance, not a festival, not a rite, but a shared moment of breath. On the night of the new moon, across the land, temples would be stilled. No chants, no drums, only silence. a moment to listen. And when that night came, it was as if Egypt inhaled. From the delta marshes to the southern cataracts, from the white walls of Memphis to the stone courtyards of Aswan, people paused. Lamps were dimmed, doors opened, the river calmed, birds roosted early. Even the jackals, who howled without fail, fell quiet. And in that vast stillness, a new kind of sound emerged. Not through ears, but through hearts. A low hum, felt more than heard, like the voice of the earth remembering its name. Children felt it first, then the old, then all. Some saw faces in their minds, unfamiliar, yet beloved. Others felt warmth behind their eyes, as if someone gently placed a hand upon their brow. A few in rare grace wept openly, not in sorrow, but in release. And then the dreams changed once more. Now when they came, they no longer ended in mystery. People dreamed of the corridor, but they walked it now, hand in hand with strangers they had not yet met in waking life. They looked into the mirrors and saw not fear, but possibility. They reached the door and opened it, and found themselves, not as they were, but as they were meant to be. Scholars began recording these dreams. At first hesitant, they soon discovered that across the land, the visions shared common symbols: an eye open beneath water, a tree growing beneath the earth, a thread of light passing from palm to palm. These symbols had no roots in doctrine or temple ritual. They belonged to something older, the dream below. That was the name the people gave it, not out of superstition, but reverence. A realm beneath the mind, beneath history, where all things once forgotten gently waited to be reclaimed. And always within that dream, two guardians watched. The girl, once sealed, now seen. The pharaoh, once nameless, now honored not with title, but with trust. They did not speak. They did not lead. They simply waited for each person to arrive in their own time. At the edge of the Black Land, near the forgotten ruins of a lesser temple, a woman named Meti, once a basket weaver, now a dream walker, gathered a circle of sleepers. Not priests, not scholars, just those who had shared the dream. They sat beneath the stars and shared their visions aloud, building a mosaic from fragments. Each remembered something the others did not. One saw the shape of the pillar. Another remembered the warmth of the girl's hand. A third described the mask, no longer hollow, now filled with light. And as they spoke, the wind turned. It moved through the gathering like a breath, gentle and steady, and for a moment all heard the same voice. Not a voice of command nor instruction, but invitation. It said, "You remember. Now choose." And they understood. The dream, once sealed away for fear it would devour the world, had returned not to conquer, but to commune. Not to rule, but to remind. The seal had been born from love. It could only be lifted by the same. And so the people began to choose. Not all at once, not in haste, but slowly, soul by soul, they welcomed the dream. They learned to walk its corridors in sleep, not as strangers, but as kin. They bore its symbols in their hearts, not in temples. And they taught their children to dream not with fear, but with listening. For beneath it all, beneath the sands, beneath the bones of time, beneath the name that was never spoken, the pharaoh still watched. The girl still waited, and Egypt remembered. In the penultimate chapter of this long, winding dream, Egypt stood quietly on the threshold, not of an ending, but of a great becoming. The silence that once fell upon the land like a shroud had transformed. It was no longer the silence of fear or of loss, but of readiness. A sacred hush, like the stillness before a song begins. Across the Nile's winding breath, people had begun to live differently. There was no proclamation, no law, no scroll that decreed it so. But hearts shifted. Markets opened more slowly in the morning, as if waiting for the sun to fully rise. Artisans left unfinished works in tribute to imperfection. Children were no longer hurried to speak. Even grief had softened. Funeral chants became lullabies. Offerings to the dead included not only bread and oil, but dreams, drawn or whispered, given like seeds to the afterlife. The temples, too, changed. Where once the gods were adored with thunder and fire, now they were approached with stillness. Incense burned not in plumes, but in threads. Chants became hums. Offerings were placed in corners where the unseen might find them. And the priests, those last keepers of tradition, became guides not to gods, but to memory. In Thebes, the high priestess Heneret gathered her acolytes one final time. They did not meet in the sanctum, not in the halls of papyrus or bronze. Instead, she led them beyond the city walls into the quiet fields where the barley whispered. There, beneath an open sky, she lay upon the earth and closed her eyes. No rite, no farewell, only a breath. And from her chest rose a moth, white as linen, silent as dawn. It drifted toward the west, where the sun would soon sleep, and the acolytes without word followed. Thus began the last quiet migration, not of bodies, but of souls, not fleeing, but returning. Each night, more gathered at the edge of the desert, not to build a new temple, but to be near the silence that now called to them. They did not name the call. They did not seek to explain it. They simply listened. And in the listening, they began to change. They called themselves the keepers of the fold, and they spoke in dreams. Each night, as they lay beneath stars, now shifting ever further into new patterns, they entered the corridor, the place so many had seen, yet never understood. And each night they walked further. Some found old selves waiting, fragments of joy, of sorrow, of unlived lives. Others met those they had forgotten, mothers, brothers, lovers never born. And at the end of it all, always were the two. The girl, the Pharaoh, no longer strangers, no longer still. Now they moved. The girl's hands traced the walls of the corridor, and where she passed, the stone bloomed with light. The Pharaoh's footsteps echoed not with weight, but with rhythm, as if he walked not on stone, but on a path shaped by music. And for those who walked with them, the corridor became something else. It became home, a place not of answers, but of peace. The fold, once sealed, had become a passage, not to escape the world, but to see it fully, to remember not only what had been lost, but what had been chosen. The people no longer feared what lay beneath thought. They welcomed it, honored it. And so, on the 21st night of the season of Shemu, a woman named Meti stood upon a dune overlooking the river. Behind her, hundreds of fires flickered. Around her, the keepers slept in silence. And above, the stars completed their slow, deliberate reshaping. She raised her hands, not in worship, but in acknowledgement. And from the horizon, two shapes approached. They were not of flesh, not ghost, not God, but memory and will, the girl and the Pharaoh. They walked slowly, side by side, and as they drew near, the air thickened, not with weight, but with memory so strong it hummed. Meti did not speak. She did not kneel. She simply opened her hands, and the girl placed a thread within them. Golden, warm, alive. Not a relic, a promise. And in that moment, Meti understood. The dream was no longer hidden. The fold was no longer guarded. It had passed, quietly and fully, into the hearts of the living, not as myth, but as lineage, as breath. She turned to face the others and whispered, "It is time." And though no one stirred, though the wind was still, she knew they had heard. The corridor no longer needed to be entered in sleep. It now lived in the waking world, in every pause before speech, in every act of quiet kindness, in the moments when fear was met not with force but with stillness. The Pharaoh, whose name had never been spoken again, smiled. The girl, whose silence had once sealed the darkness, now sang, not with voice but with presence. And in the heart of Egypt, something ancient was no longer hidden. It was known, and it was loved. In the final part of this long and slumberous tale, Egypt stood not at the brink of forgetting, but on the threshold of eternal remembering. The land had settled into something not unlike a great and waking dream, one that moved with the wind, rested in the reeds, and whispered through the branches of acacia trees under the full moon. The people, once restless with questions, had become gentle stewards of memory, their every gesture carrying the quiet weight of centuries softened by love. The stars had ceased their slow rearrangement, finding at last the shapes they had waited long to form. The sky was no longer a riddle, but a map, a reflection of what lay within. And beneath that sky, life continued not with spectacle or command, but in quiet cycles of birth, work, and breath. Still, something new stirred in the warm stillness. In a modest house near the bend of the river, where papyrus grew thick and cranes nested in the shallows, a child was born. Her name was Nebet Sheri, and from the moment her lungs filled with air, the winds of the south stilled for 3 whole breaths, and the birds bowed their wings as if in prayer. She did not cry. She looked, her gaze steady and soft, as if seeing not for the first time but remembering. Her mother, a weaver of humble linen, swaddled her with trembling hands. The midwife, old and quiet, whispered, "The fold has chosen again." She said no more. From the earliest years, Nebet Sheri proved different, not in strength or intellect, but in presence. She listened longer than others. She placed her small hands on earth and wood and seemed to hear something unspoken. Animals followed her without leash or lure. Strangers paused when she passed, struck by a fleeting sense that they had forgotten something they once loved. She did not learn the names of gods. She remembered them, not as figures carved in stone, but as moments. Warmth after sorrow, hush after song, the hush before a child speaks its first word. And she remembered, too, the corridor beneath the earth, though she had never walked it in waking life. She described it in her sleep with aching clarity, the walls smooth as water, the air alive with waiting, and at its end, two figures whose hands shaped light. As she grew, Nebetsheri never claimed a place in temple or throne. She took no title, no acolytes. Instead, on her 23rd year, she walked alone into the desert. No caravan followed her. No heralds announced her steps. She walked barefoot across the pale sands until she came to the broken shadow of an ancient obelisk, half buried and long unnamed. And there she built a circle. Not of walls or altars, but of space, a clearing in the desert wind open to all, shaped not by hand but by breath. She marked it only with a single line drawn in the sand, a spiral coiled into a heart. Word spread slowly. First came the dreamers, those who had seen the corridor and longed to walk it in wakefulness. Then the old, who no longer sought to understand, only to remember. Then children, drawn not by reason, but by instinct. And finally the silent, the ones who had always known, but never spoken. They gathered in the circle. They brought no offerings, only stories. No chants, only silence. And as the sun set, painting the dunes in gold and wine, Nebetsheri sat among them and said nothing at all. The fold no longer required guardians. It required witnesses. That night, they all dreamed the same dream. Not of descent or darkness, not of terror or awe, but of stillness. A garden beneath the earth, a river without water. A breath passed from mouth to mouth until the world itself inhaled. In that dream, the girl stood beside the pharaoh, no longer silent, no longer watching. She sang, and her song was not melody, but memory, a weaving of all that had been loved, lost, held, and released. The pharaoh, once nameless, now smiled not with triumph, but with peace. He held no crook or flail, only the hand of the girl, and in that joining, the seal no longer shone. It pulsed like a heart. The corridor was open, not to descend, but to dwell. When Nebetsheri awoke, she wept, not in sorrow, but in fulfillment. She rose and turned to the gathered, who still slept beneath the stars, and she whispered a single word that only the earth heard. Enough. And it was. The sky was still. The stars no longer moved. And the fold, once sealed by sacrifice and sustained by silence, had become the breath of the world. It lived in every pause, every kindness, every shared gaze between strangers who recognized one another not by name, but by knowing. It lived in the dreams of children who had never feared the dark. It lived in the hands of potters, the songs of midwives, and the spaces between footsteps where meaning lingered without sound. And when, years later, Nebetsheri's body returned to the earth, no tomb was built, no statue was raised. Only a thread of gold was placed atop the spot where she had sat, light, soft, and warm. It fluttered once in the wind, and then was still. But far below, where light had never lived and silence had once reigned, the corridor pulsed. The girl's song continued, and the pharaoh stood beside her, not watching, simply present. For in the end there was no end, only breath, only dream, and the remembering of a love deep enough to hold the world.